He promised to leave on time, so who or what's stopping him? Senegal's President Macky Sall has long insisted he will not stay in office past his constitutionally mandated time, but last month he drew the ire of his people when he postponed elections scheduled for February 25. The country's top court has ruled the postponement illegal. Does that put Senegal's democracy in jeopardy?
I don't agree with the headlines, the international media headlines talking about democracy dying in Africa or the country being on the brink, as The Guardian has recently titled. We need to understand that there has always been violence from above and resistance from below, resistance from the populations. And that's what democracy is about.
We'll take a closer look at what this means for the West African nation. And watch what you pack. Preparing for a trip abroad? We'll tell you why your favorite local delicacy might not make it all the way, especially if you're heading to the US. Welcome to the A55 podcast. I'm Nia Krofi Smatabe. I'm sure you've heard DJs say that when it's nice, you play it twice. So allow me to say again, welcome to the A55 podcast. I'm freaking out that this show is finally available to share with you all. I'm so happy that we get to spend every other Friday together listening to amazing stories from remarkable Africans and discussing issues that impact or will impact our continent. In case you skipped all the trailers straight to this episode, it's all good. Don't worry. Our mission here is pretty simple: to examine and redefine Africa's place in the modern world. And I must say, over the past few years, I've met people from different parts of the world who are truly interested in learning more about Africa outside of the stereotypes that persist. And given the concerns about misinformation and disinformation, I am particularly thrilled to, in my own little way, be able to contribute to reshaping the narrative about Africa. So hit us up or slide into our DMs on Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handles are at A55pod. That's A55POD, or our show's main page with your questions and suggestions, and we'll do our best to find resource people who can answer your questions. That said, let's get ready to start this show. Now, many of us grew up with our grandparents or even great-grandparents who often spoke to us in not so plain language, especially when they wanted to pass on some wisdom to us. So, in honor of our elders, we'll start each episode with some of the wisdom they passed on to us. Proverbs, we call them. Gertrude Davison Tete will be supplying the proverbs, and today's is from the Tuareg people in the Sahel.
God has created lands with lakes and bountiful rivers for man to live, and the wide deserts so that he can find his soul.
Thanks, Gertrude. A lot has happened in the world in the first 2 months of this year, and we can't possibly recap them all in a few seconds. But there's one event that we will be focusing on today because a lot of countries around the world are participating in it. And no, I'm not talking about the Olympic Games in Paris later in the year. This year is perhaps the ultimate election year because from Ghana to the US to Uzbekistan, Russia, and even the European Union, national elections are being held in 64 countries in 2024. Whereas countries like Taiwan and Pakistan have already held theirs, one of the African countries expected to have held its election in February failed to do so. On February 3, Senegal's President Macky Sall, whose term in office officially comes to an end on April 2nd, announced a postponement of the country's presidential election, which was scheduled for February 25.
I will engage in an open national dialogue to bring together the conditions for a free, transparent, and inclusive election.
The president cited a dispute over the candidate list and alleged issues of corruption. 2 days later, on February 5, the country's parliament voted to delay the elections until December 15 in a chaotic session that saw security forces forcefully remove some opposition MPs from the floor of the House. Parliament's action was met with protest on the streets and police clamping down and arresting protesters.
tear gas and smoke grenades filled the air on Friday as security forces and protesters clashed in Senegal's
Amnesty
capital.
International said at least 3 people, including a 16-year-old, were killed by security forces during the protests. And according to Human Rights Watch, more than 200 protesters were arrested during the protests. But the twists in Senegal's unfolding political crisis didn't end there. On February 15, the Constitutional Council ruled the postponement was unconstitutional and called on the government to hold elections as soon as possible. The government has agreed to do so, but is yet to set a date. So, was the postponement warranted in the first place? And what does this all mean for Senegal's democracy? And what happens when President Macky Sall leaves office on April 2nd? Joining us to discuss the implications of all this for Senegal and its democratic process is Dr. Rama Salla Dieng, a lecturer in African Studies and International Development at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. Dr. Dieng, thank you very much for joining us on the A55 podcast to talk about this developing situation in Senegal. President Macky Sall cited a dispute between Parliament and the Constitutional Council over potential candidates who are disqualified as his reason for the postponement of the election. I am assuming he's probably referring to Karim Wade and or Ousmane Sanko, but is it clear to you, or do you have an idea which candidate or candidates are supposedly at the center of this dispute that President Macky Sall is talking about?
Hello, Ni. First of all, thank you so much for having me in this podcast. I think it is very important to discuss the constitutional crisis or the institutional crisis that we are having in Senegal right now. So the 2 candidates that you are mentioning are Karim Wade, who is a son of the previous president of Senegal, just before Macky Sall, Abdoulaye Wade. So Karim Wade has a dual nationality. He's French and Senegalese. So the Senegalese constitution states clearly that if one wants to become a president, they have to be exclusively of Senegalese nationality. So Karim Wade did give up his French citizenship, but he did so very late. He didn't respect the 6-month notice that has been requested, actually. He made the request very late, leading the new French prime minister to take an accelerated or fast-track process to grant him his, exclusion or cancellation of his French citizenship. And despite all that, it was not enough. The second candidate was Rose Wardini. It's not Ousmane Sonko, who is only Senegalese, who's exclusively Senegalese. It's Rose Wardini, who is the sister of the former mayor of Dakar. And Rose Wardini, had put herself in a very delicate situation because she could have been accused of perjury. She didn't renounce her French citizenship, and just after the 19 candidates were validated, who met the sponsorship requirement, were validated by the parliament, it came to public knowledge that Rose Wardini was also French, and that is those 2 arguments that President Macky Sall used on the 5th of February to make an announcement on TV to say that this constituted an unprecedented case, and that because of complaints he received from Karim Wade being excluded, he had to start the whole process again, because Rose Wardini couldn't be a candidate despite her dual citizenship, where Karim Wade was not allowed to be a candidate. But for most citizens, the Constitution, for most presidential candidates as well, the Constitution has, clear rules around that matter, and Rose Wardini could have been excluded. This was no reason for cancelling. I'm not saying postponing, I'm saying cancelling, because as to today, we don't have a clear date for the election. And the previous date was this weekend on the 25th. So since we have no date, Macky Sall has cancelled our elections using the fallacious argument of crisis, which many people say have been fabricated by himself.
Yeah. So I'm guessing then this doesn't really rise to or warrant a postponement of the election, does it? Because, as you said, Karim Wad denounced his French citizenship, although very late. Dini was found out much later, and the main contender that a lot of us outside have heard about, which is Usman Sonko, he has already been replaced. So then we're wondering if these at least two candidates that at least I knew of before right now about Dini are not in the race, why then postpone the elections? In your view, did this warrant the postponement?
I think let's come back to Usman Sonko later, because Usman Sonko is not a dual citizen. He was excluded. He's not one of the 19 candidates whose candidacy or applications of sponsorship was rejected. So I think it's more Rose Wardini and Karim Wad's cases that warranted some investigation. But even Karim Wad also his candidacy was rejected. So here it was just a matter of excluding Rose Wardini and letting the 18 other remaining candidates go ahead.
Well, some have described what's happening in Senegal as a constitutional crisis. The opposition is calling it a constitutional coup. But we also know that just recently the country's highest court ruled that the postponement is illegal and is calling for an election to be held as soon as possible. President Sall is saying that it will be held as soon as possible, but he doesn't give us an exact date when that is going to happen, but says that he will step down on April 2nd, which is when we were expecting a new president to be sworn in. So if there's no election before April 2nd, but he's stepping down, then what exactly happens? What's going to happen in Senegal after April 2nd if we still don't have an election?
Well, that's the issue. I think what you've just described shows well the chaos in which our democracy has been put in by the current president. No one knows for sure when the elections that were due to be held on the 25th of February will be taking place. As you rightly mentioned, he is now saying that it will take place before the summer, the rainy season, to be more accurate. And right now, he's holding a national dialogue, which has been boycotted by 16 presidential candidates, only 2, including one from his coalition, the majority coalition, Amadou Ba, and his former Prime Minister, Mamadou Boun Abdallah Dionne, are the only 2 who agreed to take part in this national dialogue. So many people have been asking if what is really happening. And I think we can come to it later, but people are saying that he's just preparing his exit and negotiating an amnesty law that would prevent him from being judged for all the crimes that were committed, the human rights violations that were committed during his reign, in which almost over 50 people have lost their lives between March 2021 and now. We've had over 50 young people killed, the latest of which included 2 students from the University Gaston Berger in Saint-Louis. So this is really, this uncertainty is something that has been a cause for concern for all the Senegalese citizens who are now only asking one thing of him: the dates of the presidential elections. Because Macky Sall may leave on 2nd of April. And if that is the case, without us having a clear date, without setting a clear date for the elections, what will happen is that the president of the parliament, the National Assembly, Mama Diop, will be the one assuming the interim of the presidency until we have a new president. And you will reckon that this is really an uncertain and dangerous situation, considering the whole region, the whole institutional crisis that he has created.
And you talked about the people, the human rights situation, and you actually did write a paper that I've seen and read. I'll share the link with our listeners to read as well, about a land grab situation in Senegal, which the people of Ngo have been protesting as well. And it seems like since Macky Sall has been in office, at least for this latter part that I can remember clearly, there's always been one protest after the other. Even like after the postponement of the election, I think Amnesty said about 200 people had been arrested or so. Why is it that there seems to be just one protest after the other since Macky Sall has been in office?
Well, I think we need to analyze all that's happening at the light of the violent history that Senegal has had, because Senegal is presented as an exception in West Africa, or as a poster child for democracy. Yeah. But the truth is that the various political regime we've had have been extremely the violence is coming from the leaders, the political leaders. It's a case of state-sponsored violence where the police and those who are supposed to keep order, to use law in order to keep order, are using it, instrumentalizing it for their own benefit. And that's why the citizens are revolting. And when they revolt, it is met with brutality and, violence. And as you mentioned, in March 2021, when Ousmane Sonko, who is the main leader of Yewwi Askan Wi, which means liberating the nation, was jailed and accused of rape, many of his supporters took to the street and demonstrated, showing their anger. But when they did so, they were met with violence. They were met with brutality. At least 23 people have been killed, leading Amnesty International to produce a report asking for the authorities to halt police violence, but also to restore social media, because we've seen that there has been internet restrictions and other human rights violations taking place not only in Dakar, but also in Ziguinchor, Kaolack, the other main cities. And what we are also seeing is that those people who have been conducting these violences, people are asking even if they are part of the police, because most of them have been wearing civilian clothes, not wearing their police uniform, but are heavily armed, using weapons, lethal weapons, on the public. And same in June 2022, and that's the case you're mentioning in Gore. There had been protests because the state wanted to use a piece of land, a former parking, in fact, in order to build an Auchan supermarket. Auchan is a French-led chain of supermarkets. Okay. But the populations disagreed and wanted to build a high school because they didn't have a high school because of gentrification. They had to go to Almadi to study. So they wanted Almadi, which is the one of the most expensive neighborhoods in that part of Dakar. So because of the excessive use of force, there have been 3 people killed in June 2023 only in the Gore protest, including a 15-year-old schoolgoer, Adi Diallo. She was killed and put in the water. Up to today, there is no clear investigation. And similarly with the 14 people that were killed in March 2021 and the 25 or more people that were killed in 2023, the families are yet to have a clear, to have accountability. And what we are also witnessing is there is no separation of powers. Since Macky Sall has decided to cancel the elections, there has been at least 300 people that were liberated from the prisons, from the prison of Rebus, most of whom were arrested, arbitrarily for minor facts, never being judged, and now they are liberated without being judged. So people are asking, how come they are liberated? If there is a clear separation of power, their imprisonment should be investigated. And now Macky Sall decided to propose this amnesty law is really has people asking whether the real concern is for him to, get impunity, to prepare his exit, and rather than for those people who have been imprisoned, for those people who have lost their lives, receiving justice. So that's where we are right now.
Okay. I see what you're talking about. That okay. So then another question is he really just delaying this so that he makes sure that his immunity deal is clear and he can exit freely, or if he's really thinking about the elections going on for the country to
Exactly.
get what they really need? I'm curious to pick your mind. Do you see a possibility where when a new date is set for the election, some of the candidates like Karim Wad and Denis will eventually end up on the ballot, because then by now the 6-month period I think they should meet for the denouncing their French citizenship would probably have elapsed or something. I don't know. Do you see a possibility for them getting on the ticket as well?
I think there will be attempts to try and change the final list of presidential candidates. I think it is to be expected. But one thing that the coalition F25, that is a coalition of presidential candidates, the initial ones and the ones that were shortlisted, one thing they have made clear is that there is no going back. If we want these elections to take place, we need to accept that Karim Wad can no longer be a president because his candidacy was rejected, on the one hand. Rose Wardini hold a press conference explaining publicly that she will no longer be a candidate. So that's another problem solved. And finally, Ousmane Sonko might be liberated by then if the current amnesty negotiations go ahead. But one thing also needs to be clear. He's not one of the 19 candidates that were shortlisted by the Constitutional Court. So his party's candidate, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, needs to be the candidate for his party. I think once we are clear on those three things, those three issues, I think then we can expect to go through a smooth process of holding a new election date. If there is an attempt from any side that there might be to change that, there will be more struggles, there will be more delay, and there will be more fights.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dieng, for that explanation. So at least now we know that those two whose citizenship race questions are out, and Sonko would have to go with what the party is agreeing with, that Faye will now be the party's candidate. And if anything at all, he will probably just have to head the party as being the head of the party itself, but not the one running for presidency. Okay. But back to the election, this was supposed to be a historic election for Senegal. It was supposed to be the historic one where, since independence, there's no incumbent president running again. But now it is still historic, but in a different light, because it's historic as being the first election in Senegal to be postponed. What does this mean for democracy in Senegal?
Well, actually, there are a lot of things here that we need to disaggregate. So this crisis, the 5th February crisis, has been presented as an unprecedented case. It is the case that the elections being cancelled is quite exceptional, but we need to replace it in the longue durée to understand that President Senghor, our first president, who is often failed for his visionary leadership and promotion of African socialism, was the first one to postpone the elections in December 1962. When he had the parliament, similarly as in today, had the parliament approve the motion of censure to remove Mamadou Dia as the head of government. And a few days later, he merged the functions of president and prime minister, becoming the president and the prime minister. He organized referendum in March 1963, which allowed for Senegal to become a presidential regime. So since March 1963, we are a presidential regime. So why am I bringing this back for us to analyze? It is because Senegal, again, that image of poster child of democracy exception doesn't hold. I don't agree with the headlines, the international media headlines talking about democracy dying in Africa or the country being on the brink, as The Guardian has recently titled. But for me, we need to understand that there has always been violence from above and resistance from below, resistance from the populations. And that's what democracy is about. What we are seeing today is not a case of citizens giving up. Citizens in Senegal have mobilized since March 2021. And if I give you another historical case, May 68, the university was also the site of protest and confrontation, as is the case today. The University of Dakar, if I can remind people, has been closed and has only been opened yesterday. So since November 2023, the University of Dakar is closed. And every time there are some tensions, the university becomes the first site of confrontation rather than being a place for study and so on. But
Is it because there are intellectuals who might disagree with
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So when May 1968 happened, it started from the university, Sheikh Anta Diop. And it is from there that the strike became generalized, with major labor union joining, and later amplified. The protest was amplified by peasant movements. So I want us to understand that the university has always been a site of contestation. Right now we are seeing Senegalese academics joining the protests. And when I tell you about this history of mobilization, on 23rd of June 2012, when President Abdoulaye Wade decided to go for a third mandate, decided to try and change the constitution for a third mandate, the citizens of Senegal mobilized again. They protested. They took to the parliament. There were confrontations between the police and themselves in the streets. So just to say, and that's when Abdoulaye Wade backed down, and that's how Macky Sall came to power. So all this long history tells us something. It tells us that democracy is not a smooth, linear process. It is made of contestations. It is made of protests. It is made of power dynamics, and that's when a new social contract is negotiated. That's when what we are witnessing today is Senegalese citizens saying, enough is enough. We've had enough with the former ways of doing things. We want a new social contract. We want a leader who will listen to us. And as you said, this was going to be a historic election because we were, for the first time, not going to have an incumbent president running again for presidency. It will remain historic because I think at the end of all this, one thing we need to remember is that Senegalese citizens mobilized, they protested, and they fought back. And eventually, they managed to renegotiate and shape a new social contract. And law and order will prevail.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Dieng, for your time with us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, as you heard Dr. Dieng say, democracy is still at work in Senegal. The protests are not a death knell to the democratic process in that country, rather a demand from the people for a new social contract with the elected leaders. We'll keep following that story, and I will revisit it whenever there's any significant development. We'll be right back. Now that we are almost at the end of the show, let's shift our focus to some other news that may or may not necessarily improve your love life, but trust me, it's something you want to know. You can thank me later. So, here we go with our last segment we're calling Before You Go. Before you go, you know how we all crave food from home, especially when we are moving away from home or have been away from home for so long? Wait, is it just me? Come on, I'm sure you can relate, right? Well, a passenger from the Democratic Republic of Congo had a rude awakening at the Boston Logan International Airport when customs and immigration agents stopped him after their sniffer dog smelled something unusual in his bag. The passenger told the agents that he had some dried fish in the bag, which I suspect would have still raised some eyebrows anyway. But when the agents opened the bag, guess what they found? 4 dead and dried monkeys. According to the passenger, the monkeys were for his own consumption. But here's the thing, the US does not allow raw or minimally processed meat of certain animals that live in the wild into the country due to health concerns. The director for the Boston Airport's Customs and Border Protection Office said, quote, "The potential dangers posed by bringing bushmeat into the United States are real. Bushmeat can carry germs that can cause illness, including the Ebola virus," unquote. So what to do? All 4 kilograms or about 8 pounds of the bushmeat was seized and marked for destruction. So if you're planning a trip to the US and your friend in the US asks you to bring some bushmeat from home, you've been warned. Talk about one man's meat is another man's poison, huh? Many thanks to Dr. Rama Salla Dieng for walking us through the political situation in Senegal, and a special thanks to Dr. Alain Matojo, a political scientist and founder of Africa Polls. Thanks to my team, Bright Dra, who designed our logo and the other works you see on our social media, and to Gertrude Davison Teta, my production associate. And don't forget to follow us on IG, that's Instagram, and X, formerly Twitter. Our handles are the same, at A55pod. And do take a moment to give us a rating, please, preferably a 5-star, wherever you're listening. The ratings help others find our show because then our show can be recommended to them. So please help. We'll be back 2 Fridays from now with another exciting conversation. I'm Nia Krofi Smatabe. Have a great weekend.